Hi, my name's Stephanie Gibbons, and I'm a principal analyst in Omdia's Carrier Network Software Group. This is the first radio show in a series of 4, and today it's my pleasure to speak with Joe Marcella from Ciena. He's Vice President of Product Line Management for Packet Networking, and with over 20 years of telecom experience, he's focused mainly on software and packet optical transport and switching. Joe's here to talk about new ways to deliver IP services. Thank you for being here, Joe.
Thanks, Stephanie. It's really great to be here.
Great. So let's dive right in. First question for you, Joe. So why won't legacy IP implementations provide the simplicity, cost efficiency, and scalability required for today's networking?
That's a good question. I think I'd start by saying I'd be remiss not to recognize the success that IP has had over the years. I think everybody would have to admit, especially in these times, that we've come a long way and the world is effectively connected today because of IP. So you can kind of imagine our life today, all working from home in our home offices on our Zoom calls and Teams calls and WebEx calls without the power of IP. Maybe we don't need so much of it, but I think having that connectivity has been more timely than ever. Think about the global economy, our businesses, our children's educations, our mental health. Really, IP is the foundation which connects the entire world. So I would start out by saying it's definitely not broken. But with everything, I think evolution is a constant. It's more and more is being demanded of the network, and new stresses are being placed every day. We have to continuously ensure we are looking ahead and we're ready for what is coming next. And I believe we owe ourselves this maybe even more now than ever. Right? The fully decentralized and layered networks that have served us so well historically need to evolve to start to incorporate some new technologies built around the ideas of automation and analytics. And we really need to start relooking at some of the things that we've always sort of taken for granted, look for ways to improve. So I guess if I were to kind of rephrase your question just a little bit, I'd say, can we take what we have today and really evolve that to support the demands of the future? And I guess depending on what your definition of the future is, I would say absolutely we can, but it's going to take some pretty big steps.
Absolutely understood. And I'm really glad that you brought up some of the changes that we've been experiencing most recently, because I really think that helps accelerate some of the strategies that Ciena and some of your peers will be working on, especially over the next year. So maybe if you could build upon that a bit, Joe, you mentioned how important IP implementations have been, especially over the last 40 years. But in terms of improvements, they've been mainly incremental. And so, again, building on what you've just said, why do standard-based IP services need to be delivered differently? Is it 5G networking right now? Is it possibly the changing landscape in networking as a lot of your telco customers start to compete with some of the larger cloud providers to deliver some of these new services in 5G and in the future?
Yeah, I think you'd start by what is changing now. You could say 5G, network densification, digital transformation, multi-access edge computing, gaming, virtual reality, augmented reality, the evolution of the cloud, I guess you could say, really everything is changing now. But if I were to kind of boil it down to really the main change that's affecting the network, I would say it's scale, right? Not only is bandwidth increasing, but also the number of endpoints and services are continuously increasing. So you take, for example, 5G, people tend to view technology jumps as being more efficient than the last. And it's definitely true in 5G as well. But the other thing about 5G is it uses different spectrum, which is not necessarily more efficient. So that means we need more radios. And some people would say that's over 5 times the number of radios that we have today, which means more endpoints, more connections, and ultimately the risk of more cost and complexity. So there's a lot changing. The question is, how do we make improvements to really enable that scale to continue? And I think if I kind of boil that down, I'd say it starts with simplicity, right? How do we simplify the network to enable it to scale? Things like a common service layer that enables us to create a single type of service across the access, the edge, the metro, the data center, the core, something like an EVPN or Ethernet VPN, a common transport layer through something like segment routing, building on what we said earlier about automation and analytics. How do we take what inherently is a growing network and try to simplify it and make it easier to manage. Along those lines, I would also say openness is a big piece. As networks get bigger, having that ability to have an open network and create operator choice allows operators to really customize their network more for the reasons of scale and to create a more efficient network. And then trying to keep it to three, I'll combine the third one into two, which is performance and reliability. Right? So one of the first things we need to worry about as the network continuously grows and scales is performance and reliability. Things like network convergence times and restoration speeds, all of those things really need to be considered as we reach into a new phase of network scale. So I guess to summarize, I'd say that there's a lot changing, and thus we really need to start looking at a new model for the future.
Absolutely. I would say that Omdia's research agrees with that, especially because of 5G. So you talk about scalability, you talk about flexibility, and what we're also seeing as that end game there is with that scalability and that flexibility and the openness that operators are able to do, they're being able to push out services to the customer. And the key point is those customized or differentiated services, really to start competing against some of the larger competitors that have entered the space. So what you say resonates for sure. So what does IP delivered differently really mean? And how does it relate to adaptive IP? And before you answer, would you mind telling us how Ciena defines adaptive IP?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I would start by combining those two into the same answer. I mean, adaptive IP essentially means IP delivered differently. And it essentially means that what we were trying to deliver is more than just IP. It's more than just about a set of protocols. So don't get me wrong, though, that the right protocols are critically important and essentially table stakes for everything we're trying to do. But using the word differently means we need to go beyond that. So we think of going beyond that in really three main categories. One we call the programmable infrastructure, which is essentially a fancy name for the network. But in the network, we need to build this, so we believe we need to build this around the idea of an open and disaggregated operating system, so a network operating system. So this essentially means a modern OS architected around next generation software components such as microservices that enable us to run in a number of different operating environments, whether that's fully integrated, a bright box model, a white box model, a COTS x86 model, whether we want to run it as a virtual network function or a physical network function. The software architecture, the software operating system really forms the foundation of how we can create that flexibility and enable that operator choice if they want to go into a disaggregated world. The second piece I'd say around programmable infrastructure, though, is really the first word, which is programmable. How do we make the network more programmable? It still amazes me that we still manage IP networks around the world using CLI commands. People around the world every day are typing in commands, entering scripts that really drive the global IP network through manual intervention. If we're going to get beyond that, we need a much more flexible programmable interface to that network built around the idea of open APIs, things like netconf with standardized Yang models. OpenConfig is a good example. Things like streaming telemetry through gRPC or GNMI to get that data in real time off the network. Those sort of really form the foundation, I think, of the different part of what we want to do with the network. But once we have that programmable infrastructure, what do we do with it? Well, the second thing we need to think about is automation. So, how do we automate that network? We talked about CLI, and CLI has historically been what we use, but I don't think that's going to really enable us to get to where we want to go. It's very error prone, as we talked about. We want to be able to leverage things like service templating to create end-to-end service across the network. We want to automate SLA management. We want to automate troubleshooting. We want to effectively simplify, as we talked about before, the network to enable it to scale to where we need to be. And the third piece is, now that we have the programmable infrastructure, we've automated it. Where's the intelligence that's really going to drive that automation? And this kind of gets back to what we said before. Now that I'm streaming all of this wonderful real-time streaming telemetry off the network, what can I do with it? Well, we want to feed that into analytics machines that are really powered by advanced machine learning algorithms so that we can detect anomalies and using policy-based control, then make decisions about what we want to do. So that sort of feeds into the cycle of real-time telemetry coming off the network, making decisions through policy controls that are then automated and then programmed back into the network through those open APIs that we talked about before. So I guess to sum all that up and to answer your question, it's really going beyond just the protocols to create a multi-vendor network with policy-based closed-loop automation. That's really what we mean by adaptive IP and why we think it's different.
Absolutely, especially on that programmable infrastructure side. We take a look at it, how it needs to be accessed and configured with those common open interfaces. That absolutely gets to that software control and automation. We also throw in with software like SDN and NFV and those open APIs. Any type of service provider really can try to simplify that, call it the end-to-end management of the network. And we certainly see that as important for delivering IP services. So it'll be interesting to see how this year continues. Well, to round out the discussion, Joe, Ciena really emphasizes the because you asked narrative on its adaptive IT marketing and messaging. In your words, tell us why that's relevant.
Well, I guess, because you asked, I guess I would simplify it to say because it's true. When we introduced the idea of the adaptive network 3 or 4 years ago, it really resonated with our customer base. But as you can imagine, the first question they started asking us was, well, why can't we apply these same concepts to the IP layer? And that's where our journey began. I mean, to be clear, it wasn't. We had already decided to invest in IP, and we'd begun that journey. But by applying the adaptive network concepts to the IP layer, it really gave us a new focus point to really drive our strategic solution going forward. So what the customers were effectively asking us to do is to create a new way of delivering standard-based IP services differently by leveraging a network that's both automated, open, and lean. So maybe to put it in another analogy, we have a large Canadian R&D facility. So internally, I've learned a lot of hockey analogies over the years, but essentially what they were asking us to do is intercept the puck where it was headed and not where it was, and apply those adaptive IP concepts or adaptive network concepts to the IP or IP layer. And that's essentially the journey we've been on for the last few years.
Excellent. And that's definitely a vision for the future. And it sounds like you're executing on it right now with the adaptive network altogether.
Absolutely.
Well, with that, I want to thank you, Joe, for joining today.
Thanks, Stephanie. It was fun being here.
And thanks to all who are listening in. And don't forget to tune in for the next radio show in this 4-part series. We'll be speaking with Raphael Francis of Ciena and Sterling Perrin of Heavy Reading about the differences between 5G and previous generations of mobile network technology. So thanks again and have a great day.